Good evening. This is Dale Rotz, and this is my attempt at this week's Ecotheology and Ethics video. The two books that we had this week to read were pretty interesting, but I'd like to talk about the Johnson book first. On page 211, Johnson focuses on the relationship between God and humanity, and that when we, us humans, actually talk about creation, really don't think about all of creation. All we ever think about is the humanity side of creation. We don't think about the rest of it. And I think that's a very true and valid statement. Also on page 213, Johnson focuses on the natural world and the need to comfort it because of the devastation of human sins. And I think a good example of human sins and devastation of the earth is strip mining. Have you ever seen what landscape looks like after strip mine, after the earth has been strip mined? It's pretty devastating, and I think it's probably the epitome of devastation that human sins could ever afflict on the earth itself. However, there are mitigation rules that are in place to force mining companies to reclaim or to fix the land after they've removed the coal. Well, of course, they don't go ahead and fill up the hole that they've dug where they've removed the coal. But prior to removing the coal, they've removed all the topsoil and they've set it aside. And after they strip mine the coal out, they've gone ahead and contoured the land again, kind of smoothed it all out, made it kind of presentable again, then put that topsoil back on, seeded mainly with native grasses and things to that effect. And it's all pretty much aesthetically pleasing to the eye, and that's how they reclaim the soil. So also on page 216, Johnson talks about the need to imagine ourselves as part of the creation story, not the creation story. And I think that kind of alludes to what I said initially as far as part of creation. We need to see ourselves as part of that community of creation. There was a statement that she says, I like the statement that says, we need to come down off our pinnacle of privilege. And I think that's a very important thing for us to keep in mind through the rest of our lives. There's also a comment made that every year multiple species go extinct at an alarming rate due to human actions. Well, I think this statement might be partially true, but animals have become extinct since the beginning of time. And I don't think that human actions have always been the cause. So I kind of disagree with that statement. I think it's partially true, but I don't totally agree with that statement. The next book was the Atfield book, and I feel that there are a few items that I'd kind of like to talk about. The Atfield mentions that the sustainability of a practice or a society is basically the capacity to be practiced or maintained indefinitely. The word indefinitely to me is a very, very long time, and I don't feel that there's any form of early advocacy of a sustainable form to society that can make that happen. There's just too many variables in place that doesn't make that possible. Atfield discusses this sustainability development, and the definition of development is understood as a comprehensive economic and social and cultural and political process, which really aims at a constant improvement of the well-being of the habitat and the territory. And it's also on an active part in free participation. But I don't think that creation outside of humanity really cares much about this comprehensive economic and social and cultural and political process. The thing about sustainability development, it has to take all the creation into consideration, not just the humanity side. And when you talk about economics and social and cultural political process, you're talking about money, and that's it. On page 151, it talks about the need for population control, and that such a plans are justifiable, include policies that are encouraging people to limit the size of their families as long as they're doing it voluntarily. And then it goes on to say that minorities are not discriminated against, people's vulnerability is not manipulated to induce them to comply with national objectives. They must participate freely. Well, the thing about this statement is that I don't like the fact that minorities are singled out in this statement. No one should be discriminated against. It shouldn't have specified or picked out minorities, because in reality, us white Caucasian former European descendants or European descendants are quickly becoming a minority. But I do agree with the statement that education is an important part of population control. But on the other hand, I don't agree with that population policies that are fostering this education is particularly important with the education of women and girls by educating with the prospect of reducing the fertility. I don't think it has any merit. All education about reducing fertility should be across the board because boys and men, we have just as much big a role about overpopulation as the girls and the women do. So I think that's kind of an unfair statement, and I don't agree with it. On page 155, O'Neill and Crocker state that the problem with the famine really persists malnutrition, which makes sense. If you have a famine, there is going to be malnourished people. However, they continue by saying that if malnutrition is tackled soon enough, famines can be averted, which really makes no sense. It's like they're putting the cart in front of the horse. So then they go on and they continue saying that famines are preventable by human action. And then they argue that it's usually the case with regard to malnutrition too. Well, there's another statement that I don't agree. It says, I can see how man can be responsible for malnutrition. If you starve someone or you don't allow them or don't give them food, you could potentially cause them to be malnourished. But a famine is something that is uncontrollable by man. A famine, for the most part, is mainly caused by poor crops. And the poor crops are probably there due to the lack of rainfall. That's what's going to cause a famine. Or it could be a disease that came and wiped out things, or insects or something to that effect could have wiped out the crop. But I don't feel that man has any control over that, at least not that I know of so far. It also talks about the statement that whenever genetically modified organisms are released into the environment, there's a danger that the ecosystems will be disrupted through these newly released strains of outcompeting these native species. And I think this is kind of what Polly was alluding to in her video about the salmon that were in Norway, about these genetically modified salmon getting out and breeding with the native species. Now this statement is very problematic. It's currently an issue with this trade negotiations with China and the soybeans. There's fear that there will be cross-pollination with the native crops that they already have in China. It's also a factor here in the United States, where if you have a farmer and he's trying to raise organic non-GMO crops, but he's doing it right next to a farmer who's raising soybeans that are genetically modified soybeans, there is this potential that there's going to be some cross-pollination taking effect. So when that organic farmer goes out and actually harvests his organic crop, it truly will not be organic because there has been some cross-pollination is possible. He cannot guarantee that this cross-pollination didn't take place. Well, this is definitely going to cause some type of economic hardship for the organic farmer. Another thing that we kind of talked about and it kind of alluded to in there was talking about outcompeting these native species and choking out in the manner of like a superweed or whatever it is. In the South, there's a weed, there's a crop that came in that's called kudzu. And I don't believe it's a genetically modified plant, but it kind of helps explain this problem because it's not a native plant to the United States. The Highway Department actually brought it into the United States from Europe to prevent erosion along the highway systems. They were having a hard time, dealing with the erosion along this federal highway system. So they brought this plant in to prevent erosion. But they didn't know that this plant was going to, once it got established, it was just going to grow like wildfire, and has now come to the point where it's actually choking out trees and bushes and things to that effect because it actually limits the amount of sunlight that the trees need, and it just chokes them out. So this precautionary principle that Atfield was talking about for quite a bit of this chapter really wasn't taken into consideration when kudzu was introduced. And now it's reached a point that it's actually uncontrollable. In Polly's video, she asked us if we knew some kind of a scripture that discusses something about creation. And the only thing that I could remember and think about was Psalm 102, and it was verses 25 and 26 were the ones that I think that kind of fits this criteria. And the text reads, "Long ago you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will endure. They will wear out like a garment. You change them like clothing, and they will pass away." And to me, that kind of alludes to the fact that what he has created is going to be in this constant state of change. It'll perish, you will endure, they'll wear out, you'll change them like clothing, and they'll bring them back in, and then they'll pass away again. And it's just this cycle of life goes round and round. Well, that's all I have for now. Thank you for your time. Blessings on your weekend.